Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to explore something that is so central to Jungian analysis and Jungian thought, which is the transformation of attitudes. So there are many things that go into an analysis. Most people are familiar with analyzing dreams, for instance. But often the point of all of this work can sometimes get muddied. And so Jung reminds us, scattered throughout his writings, that it's the one-sided attitude, which is the orientation towards repetitive action, the readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way is the attitude. And when that central attitude is not balanced, that we begin to become symptomatic. Analysis and all of the various things that Jung suggested is an attempt to change the way in which we get ready to be in life. And when that kind of mainframe program shifts, the whole personality shifts. And so we're going to talk about what Jung meant by attitude and how that's relevant to the transformation process. So I'll start just by perhaps saying in a less muddy way that Jung described an attitude as a readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way. So that reflects an overarching mental or emotional orientation that shapes how we engage with the world, with ourselves, and with our experiences. It can be consciously adopted and sometimes unconsciously just reveals itself. And it affects our lives enormously.
You know, I'm thinking of, while you were talking, Joseph, one of the things I was thinking about was the way that dreams can actually provide an attitude correction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always that you wake up from a dream and the dream is like, look, and you're like, oh, but it does sometimes happen. I mean, it happens for me. I like to do dream incubation quite a bit. And it will often happen that I'll do a dream incubation about something and then I'll get this dream. And the dream will make me just like see it from a different angle. I hadn't seen it before. So for example, maybe if I'm having if I'm in a conflict with someone and I'm just, I've got my whole narrative about what's going on and what's important and what I need to pay attention to. And I tend to be sort of conflict avoidant. So maybe I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to say anything, but maybe I should say something. And what does my dream maker have to say about this? And then I get this dream, and the dream is like, shows the situation from a completely different stance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even about the conflict anymore. And I'm like, oh. And then it's like, then my whole thing in my head about, oh, this person did this thing and I'm really upset about it. Do I say, it's like, it just goes away because it's like, oh, that's not even what it's about, So that's a really miraculous thing when a dream can do that. But usually it does it in like smaller ways. I mean, I think that's, in a sense, that's what the dream maker wants, is to help us foster this new attitude. Jung talks about the new attitude, but I think we could also thinking about it as gaining a new perspective.
I think, here it is. It turns out that the new attitude, which we cavalierly talk about as, so-and-so needs an attitude adjustment. Come on, get with it. But it's really very complex. And yet it's so fundamental. And in some ways, it's so simple because we have that kind of aha reaction of like, oh, now I get it. And I'm thinking about an experience in the dreams that it parallels one of Jung's examples of dreams. He had a client that he found really, kind of ordinary and mundane and hadn't really, truly connected. And he dreamt that he was down below a big castle or mansion or something, and that he saw her up on a balcony or through a window. And he realized that the dream was telling him that he had missed her in an essential way, because in the dream he was looking up to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a relative by marriage that I met late in life who was dear and kind and generous. And I never really had a big conversation with her. We stayed on very mundane kinds of things. She cooked very traditional kinds of foods and so on. And after she died, she was older than I, of course, I had a dream of her dressed in a fantastic suit, carrying a briefcase, in pumps, and looking great, looking very corporate, like she was like the head of some big company. And I realized too, much as Jung did, that she was so much more than I had realized. And of course, is my interior image of something ordinary that took on a whole new, a new attitude of authority and a wonderful professional sort of persona. And I've never forgotten that dream. It was some time ago, and it wasn't the big thing that knocked me off my horse like Paul on the road to Damascus. But it was a new attitude.
So another way of saying it is that before you had the dream, you had a particular way of looking at that person or that situation which you recognized. And then in the dream, an unconscious material, unconscious attitude, an additional way is added. And if we can remember the dream and really take it in, then the old way of seeing the person and the new way of seeing the person come together. And then there is this more fulsome way of perceiving the situation or the outer object that frees up something in you, something in the dreamer, because when we're one-sided or when we're missing something, our energy is kind of locked up. And Jung called that locked up feeling a neurosis.
And what shifted for Jung, I dare say, and certainly shifted in me, was a kind of arrogance. And that was replaced by respect and more humility.
And of course, the dream may have been about your feelings about her,
Mm-hmm.
but there may also have been an inner correlate.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. I'm just thinking, one of the reasons I love this topic, even though in a way it's kind of vague, and I think when we talked about doing this topic, we all had a kind of similar reaction, is that many times when I'm working with someone, when I'm sitting with someone in the midst of their struggle and their suffering, it is that sense that something new needs to be constellated, and I've seen it and seen the need for it and then seen it happen, that it does amount to a new attitude. So someone comes in and they're just feeling, say, kind of chronically unfulfilled, in their work life. And it isn't, sometimes it's, oh, I got to go get another job or change careers or something. But sometimes it's like, no, it was really just that there needed to be a new attitude about it. Not in the kind of facile way that you might be thinking, oh, just buck up and get over it and try to see the bright side. But something really kind of more fundamental. Joseph, I think going back to your definition about how am I sort of prepared to see, interpret, respond, react to the world? And what if I just shifted things just a little bit? Then I might have different reactions. I mean, it wouldn't, if you've got a terrible workplace, it's not like the new attitude is going to totally change that. But it may make it clear that the task maybe is not what you thought it was, or like in my case with my dream, it's like, oh no, it's not about whether or not I confront her. This is like that's not even what this is about. This is about, this is about me and my vulnerabilities and her vulnerabilities and me and where I am. This year, my Wellspring Women's Retreat is happening in Italy from the 10th to the 16th of August. We thought hard about where to host our first European gathering and in the end chose Montepulciano near Siena. I first went to Italy when I was 18 and fell head over heels in love, especially with the spectacular medieval city of Siena. I was lucky enough to be part of an Etruscan excavation project on that trip and became totally fascinated by this mysterious ancient culture and by Italy in general. When I've had the chance, I've tried to keep up my Italian, and I've loved reading Italian myths and fairy tales throughout my life. So, for my annual women's gathering, this region felt like the right place. I can't wait to share the local stories and take some trips together to see some of Tuscany's most magical archaeological sites. There will, of course, be all the usual Wellspring offerings too: fairy tales, daily yoga, dream work, massage, and plenty of time to relax together. I'd love for you to join me. There will be a link in the show notes for you to read all the details and make a booking.
And so we can have a kind of fixed attitude towards any number of things, whether it's a friend, our workplace, the house we live in. And when Jung was often writing about life-changing alterations of attitude, he's saying that the new attitude is synonymous with a way of life.
Yes.
Which is kind of like the way that we are on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's any kind of a change at that level, everything gets a big shakeup, which is often not something that we can do on our own.
No.
We don't really have our fingers that deep into the programming.
And we couldn't.
Probably shouldn't, actually,
The difference between the program and the hard drive. That's really great. I have a little quote that I liked a lot, Jung, that says, he says, unless there is a personal experience, realizing from the inside what it means, nothing happens. Such an experience can take many forms. For instance, falling in love, anything which is really lived. So that, not just thought and figured out and problem solved, and there's all that stuff is really good. But when there's an inner conflict, you can't really just think your way through it. You would have done that already if it was that kind of issue.
And we're missing information. That's the thing is, if we could figure it out so facilely on a conscious level, we would already have done it. And it wouldn't be a mysterious attitude. It's that there's something truly novel and probably a little disturbing to us that keeps knocking on the door, and we just keep pretending we don't hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where dreams are so helpful, because we're kind of forced to open the door in the dream drama that we wouldn't probably take a look at otherwise.
So maybe I'll give an example from my personal life about sort of the cultivation of the new attitude. It was a biggie. And I think as we're talking about this, I think there can be little ways that you cultivate a new attitude, like my example with the dream, but then there are those really big ones. And, this is a story that I've told before on the podcast, but I was in my 20s. I was in my late 20s. I was in graduate school. I was, all ready to go to law school. And I was dating this guy and it was going great. And I was, we were going to get married in my mind. So I had my life all figured out as, had this career path and I had this relationship. And then he ended the relationship, and it kind of plunged me into something which made me sort of rethink everything. And it sort of felt like everything kind of fell apart. Well, something like that.
Something fell apart.
Something fell apart. And I found myself just feeling so sorry for myself, really. I mean, I had this little temper tantrum in my head, like kind of to the universe or God or whatever you want to call it. Like, why can't I just get my way? Why can't I just have this thing? I want this thing, And it's like, maybe if I do this or I do that, or I, walk in a circle counterclockwise 8 times underneath the full moon, I'll get what I want,
Mm.
I just wanted what I wanted. And it was like, eventually it's like, no, that's not going to work, you know? And I had to, so there was a sort of sense of kind of surrendering my insistence on trying to just kind of get my way. On an internal level, I had to be like, well, okay, I guess I just got to buckle up and go along for the ride. And I'm going to read something in a minute from Jung that I think explains this really well, but I had to just sort of give up and let things happen.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of do the next right thing. That's what they say in AA, which is so great. And then Jung says almost the exact same thing in a letter. When you don't know what to do, just do the next right thing, And I sort of started doing that, and I didn't know what was going to happen or where it was going to go. And in that time, that's when I sort of discovered Jung. I mean, I'd known about him before, but this was my discovery for myself. And and I just kind of kept on putting one foot in front of the other until I emerged out the other side of it. On the road to becoming a Jungian analyst. But it took years, and it took it was a lot of being worked on by life, and having to let go of things and just wait for the new thing to come. Like, I remember in the middle of all this, kind of realizing that this career that I thought I had just was so in love with, and I thought this was what I was going to do forever and ever, and just realizing that I just didn't have any more energy for me. This is my prior career, and just being like, oh my God, just like sitting in that nothingness and like wanting to know what is going to happen next, but part of the new attitude is you can't force it. You can't muscle it. You have to just let it happen until it grows. So that's maybe just one. I mean, it's not super helpful because there's no formula. And Jung says that later in this thing I'm going to read. But, it's like you have to trust. You have to trust that the new thing will constellate.
And specifically, he advises that as we're brooding, and I like the idea of brooding, the way a hen will sit on a nest and wait and wait and wait, is to pay attention to one's fantasies in the waiting process, because the fantasies are the strange way that ideas and symbols are like nudging us towards a realization.
Maybe I will just go ahead and read this. This is from his introduction to The Secret of the Golden Flower. As I have said, the essential reason which prompted me to look for a new way, which is another term, I think, for the new attitude, was the fact that the fundamental problem of the patient seemed to me insoluble unless violence was done to one or the other side of his nature. I had always worked with a temperamental conviction that at bottom there are no insoluble problems, and experience justified me insofar as I have often seen patients simply outgrow a problem that had destroyed others. This outgrowing, as I formally called it, proved on further investigation to be a new level of consciousness. Some higher or wider interest appeared on the patient's horizon, and through this broadening of his outlook, the insoluble problem lost its urgency. It was not solved logically in its own terms, but faded out when confronted with a new and stronger life urge. It was not repressed and made unconscious, but merely appeared in a different light, and so really did become different. What on a lower level had led to the wildest conflicts and to panicky outbursts of emotion from the higher level of personality now looked like a storm in the valley seen from the mountaintop. This does not mean that the storm is robbed of its reality, but instead of being in it, one is above it. But since, in a psychic sense, we are both valley and mountain, it might seem a vain illusion to deem oneself beyond what is human. One certainly does feel the affect and is shaken and tormented by it, yet at the same time one is aware of a higher consciousness looking on, which prevents one from becoming identical with the affect. A consciousness which regards the affect as an object and can say, I know that I suffer. What our text says of indolence, indolence of which a man is conscious, and indolence of which he is unconscious, are 1,000 miles apart, holds true in the highest degree of affect. Now and then it happened in my practice that a patient grew beyond himself because of unknown potentialities, and this became an experience of prime importance to me. In the meantime, I had learned that all the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They must be so, for they express the necessary polarity inherent in every self-regulating system. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. I therefore asked myself whether this outgrowing, this possibility of further psychic development, was not the normal thing, and whether getting stuck in a conflict was pathological. Everyone must possess that higher level, at least in embryonic form, and must, under favorable circumstances, be able to develop this potentiality. When I examined the course of development in patients who quietly, as if unconsciously, outgrew themselves, I saw that their fates had something in common. The new thing came to them from obscure possibilities, either outside or inside themselves. They accepted it and grew with its help. It seemed to me typical that some took the new thing from outside themselves, others from inside, or rather that it grew into some persons from without and into others from within. But the new thing never came exclusively either from within or from without. If it came from outside, it became a profound inner experience. If it came from inside, it became an outer happening. In no case was it conjured into existence intentionally or by conscious willing, but rather seemed to be borne along on the stream of time. We are so greatly tempted to turn everything into a purpose and a method that I deliberately express myself in very abstract terms in order to avoid prejudicing the reader in one way or the other. The new thing must not be pigeonholed under any heading, for then it becomes a recipe to be used mechanically, and it would again be a case of the right means in the hands of the wrong man. I have been deeply impressed by the fact that the new thing prepared by fate seldom or never comes up to conscious expectations. And still more remarkable, though the new thing goes against deeply rooted instincts as we have known them, it is a strangely appropriate expression of the total personality, an expression which one could not imagine in a more complete form. What did these people do in order to bring about the development that set them free? As far as I could see, they did nothing but let things happen. Consciousness is forever interfering, helping, correcting, and negating, never leaving the psychic processes to grow in peace. It would be simple enough if only simplicity were not the most difficult of all things. To begin with, the task consists solely in observing objectively how a fragment of fantasy develops. Nothing could be simpler, and yet right here the difficulties begin. Apparently one has no fantasy fragments, or yes, there's one, but it is too stupid. Dozens of good reasons are brought against it. One cannot concentrate on it. It is too boring. What would come of it anyway? It is nothing but this or that, and so on. The conscious mind raises innumerable objections. In fact, it often seems bent on blotting out the spontaneous fantasy activity in spite of real insight and in spite of the firm determination to allow the psychic process to go forward without interference. Occasionally, there is a veritable cramp of consciousness. If one is successful in overcoming the initial difficulties, criticism is still likely to start in afterwards in the attempt to interpret the fantasy, to classify it, to aestheticize it, or to devalue it. The temptation to do this is almost irresistible. After it has been faithfully observed, free rein can be given to the impatience of the conscious mind. In fact, it must be given, or obstructive resistances will develop. But each time the fantasy material is to be produced, the activity of consciousness must be switched off again. In most cases, the results of these efforts are not very encouraging at first. Usually they consist of tenuous webs of fantasy that give no clear indication of their origin or their goal. Also, the way of getting at the fantasies varies within individuals. For many people, it is easiest to write them down. Others visualize them, and others again draw or paint them with or without visualization. If there is a high degree of conscious cramp, often only the hands are capable of fantasy. They model or draw figures that are sometimes quite foreign to the conscious mind. These exercises must be continued until the cramp in the conscious mind is relaxed. In other words, until one can let things happen, which is the next goal of the exercise. In this way, a new attitude is created, an attitude that accepts the irrational and the incomprehensible simply because it is happening. This attitude would be poison for a person who is already overwhelmed by the things that happen to him. But it is of the greatest value for the one who selects, from among the things that happen, only those that are acceptable to his conscious judgment, and is gradually drawn out of the stream of life into a stagnant backwater. I just think that's one of the most comprehensive descriptions of the process of psychological growth, maybe that exists in the collected works.
I think that is really central and complicated to take in all at once, but very, very clear. I would say, listen to that again and again, take notes, because it's so much is right there of the process of change, and how images that come forth from the collective unconscious that spring from archetypes as our fantasies or dream image, or something that comes in from the outside. Somebody says something to us and it just goes like, oh, of how that can meet consciousness, cognition, and work together. And I think we're also, at least I am going into another of our tropes here from Jung, of how to hold the tension of the opposites and allow images and fantasies to develop, to engage them, and let things happen. Surrender consciousness so that you let things happen and simply pay attention to them. It's not that the unconscious is always right, quote unquote, but you have to let it appear, give it space, and entertain it consciously. And then there's that eureka moment that, oh, I get it. Something happened. And a process of discernment of, now which way do I go? What do I make of it? But that is a terrifically fertile passage that you just read from Jung.
It is. I'm going to offer a really boiled down piece just so we can have a place to stand, which is the answer is obviously getting rid of the separation between conscious and unconscious. And there are multiple ways of doing it. As you were saying in that wonderful summary, paying attention to fantasies which requires not interfering with them or banishing them because they seem disturbing. So we cannot condemn the stuff that comes out of the unconscious fantasies. We have to recognize them as significant. If we adopt the symbolic attitude, that can give us some breathing room around the embarrassment that interferes with allowing our fantasies to move forward to something that releases energy inside of us. So, and I notice this frequently with my analysands, is that when we're talking about a dream, they'll provide something of an association or a thought process. They'll add about a sentence. And if it's a fantasy, what I'll do, which drives them a little crazy, is I'll say, well, let's start with that sentence. And then what happens? And then what happens? And then what happens? And we'll do this maybe for 30 minutes. And at certain points, they're like shaken. But once they just close their eyes and ask the inner script maker, because the unconscious has actually written a movie script in response to some place that we're stuck. And we know that we're finally getting the medicine because as the fantasy goes down and down and down the path, almost always there's a final moment where something lets go. Something, the cramp in consciousness lets go. And people they'll cry or they'll sigh or they'll smile, which they couldn't imagine at the beginning of the fantasy, which seemed so troubling to them. Mixing the conscious and the unconscious mind, which Jung just found in the Rosarium woodcuts, which is that the king and the queen in these various stages become one thing, one creature, which represents the melding of those two ways of being. And the more that happens, the more resources that we have. And I would venture to say that almost every rigorous system of meditation, spiritual development, in some way is approaching that process. Even meditation, you're quietly watching without interfering what comes up. That's the basis of Vipassana. So people just scan their bodies and then they watch what comes up without interfering with it and also without over-identifying with it.
Right. And he mentions that, that if you can observe yourself, look at me, I'm angry, that's so different than just being caught in the anger.
So that's the difference between having the complex versus the complex having you. This new attitude ties in and overlaps or connects with so many other things that we have talked about on the podcast and that Jung talks about in the collected works. Complexes, transcendent function, holding the tension of the opposites, suffering, amor fati, or the love of one's fate, one's existing life situation. It's all there all the time as the essential operations of individuation.
And we stand in, as Jungians, a basic presupposition that there are insights that are potentially present in every person that can be made conscious, and that those insights free something up inside of us that was stuck.
I'm listening to us, and I think we all have a lot of conviction about this because we've seen it in our lives, and we've seen it in the lives of the people that we work with, and I think what we're talking about is kind of we're trying to describe a process of psychological growth and change that we know can resolve symptoms. I mean, I love that part where he says, is it inner or outer? And if it starts as an inner experience, it becomes an outer happening because, like when people come in with some inner problem, I know that if our work together works, their outer life will change. In some sense, some people say as an analyst, you're not supposed to care about what happens to the patient. But I don't know that I stand there because, it's sort of like someone comes in and they've got this real inner thing. But then, 2 years later, they now have more relationships in the outer world, and they like their job better, and they've, taken up a painting class, and the inner work will manifest in the outer world. Symptoms do get better, but we're not looking for symptom resolution. That's not what this process. That's like an after effect of the process of psychological change. So the kind of standard medical model mental health approach is you're anxious, and so you come in and you want to feel less anxious. But I think the psychodynamic approach or the depth approach or certainly the Jungian approach is no, there's going to be a change in your personality. And Jung describes it in that passage that I wrote. There's the development of a new level of consciousness. And then it's not like the symptoms, you're no longer anxious because I got in there under the hood with a wrench and like tightened a few loose bolts, and then you're not anxious anymore. It's like, something surprising happened, something that you couldn't have predicted. You changed and you grew in a new way. And now you have a different relationship with your problems. I would say that for myself, like I still, after I, went through this process of growth, I definitely still, was sorry that the relationship had failed and yearned for another relationship. I had a different relationship with that problem though. And it didn't stop being a problem, but it occupied a different place in my life. I thought about it differently. I had a different feeling about it. And that, I want to say made it more bearable or something, but it allowed something to move. I wasn't stuck. I wasn't in that psychological cramped space that Jung mentions. So
it reminds me of a moment in my own analysis where I'd been raised in a very, very violent home, lots of problems. And so in the many years of my analysis, I would come in and tell these long stories, and I would often tell the same story over and over again, trying to do something rather. My analyst was infinitely patient, and literally one day I walked in, sat down, I could feel myself wanting to launch into the story, and then all of a sudden it became absolutely clear to me that I was bored, which was a new attitude. I was like, oh my God, I am so bored telling these same 8 stories that I kept circling around. And I just looked at my analyst and I said, I'm not even going to talk about this anymore. And so just as you were saying, Lisa, it's not that I didn't live those things, but all of a sudden the charge had finished in it. And then it became kind of like just a journalistic report that I could file on the shelf inside of my psyche, and then walk past that book without it talking to me anymore. That was an enormous, miraculous process to just get bored with my complaining. If someone had told me, let's say a year earlier, I'm bored hearing you, or can't you just get bored with telling that story? I probably would have shut up because I would have been embarrassed. But I don't think I would have felt the freedom to put it on the shelf and just then pay attention to other things that are more fruitful, or just other things, period, because I'm not staring anymore.
It's a huge process, and people do that. We all do that in our process. That process of circumambulating, or I make the analogy to making cornstarch pudding, is all liquid and has no hope that we can see at the outset of really changing. But we patiently stir the pot, tend the heat, not too hot, not too cold, until eventually the change occurs. And that goes back to what we said before about really paying attention and giving space to the things that arise in us, where we're stuck, where we're hooked. And then somehow mysteriously, we get unhooked, or we come to a tipping point, or we simply outgrow the problem. I often use the image of a tree, and it starts out as a sapling. Let's say a tree trunk is 4 inches in diameter. And somebody comes along with an axe and takes a giant wedge out of that little tree's trunk. And it's awful. And it is monumental to our little sapling. But it survives. And by the time it has grown bigger, and its trunk is now, let's say, 12 inches in diameter, the gash is still there. It's had an effect, but the tree is bigger. There are more branches. It's sturdier. And so now that has been integrated and is no longer front and center as it was originally.
That's a really good metaphor, Deb. I like your visual metaphors. And since I've never made cornstarch pudding, I will offer another one. But I think it's great because you start to get just a feel for it. And like Jung says, this isn't a recipe, right?
It's my theory. Like Jung has the collected works, and I have the cornstarch pudding theory of change.
But have you ever churned butter?
Once I did.
Yeah. So this is something I did with the kids when they were little. You get some cream, some whole cream, and you put it in a jar, and then you shake and you shake and you shake, and you're just like, nothing's going to happen here. Nothing's going to happen. And then you keep shaking, and it still keeps feeling like hopeless. Like there's no change. There's no change. And then all of a sudden, after you've shaken much longer than you think you should have to shake, there's butter. It just happens all of a sudden. But sometimes psychological change is like that.
That we can't necessarily just attack the problem, but something else needs to happen. I'll read a very short quote.
I read a long one. You can read a long one too.
No, I'm not going to read another long one. The treatment must do more than destroy the old morbid attitude. It must build up a new attitude that is sound and healthy. This requires a fundamental change of vision. Not only must the patient be able to see the cause and origin of his neuroses, he must also see the legitimate psychological goal towards which he is striving. We cannot simply extract his morbidity like a foreign body, lest something essential be removed along with it, something meant for life. Our task is not to weed it out, but to cultivate and transform this growing thing until it can play its part in the totality of the psyche. So, this idea of the emergent, whether it's the little bits of butter that start to accumulate in the shaking, and then you keep shaking it and it grows until it's a nice cohesive piece of butter that you can just lift out of the milk whey. Or Deb, as you were saying, it's a growing thing, like a sapling. And that once we discover there's a sapling, you don't have to worry about all the other weeds and briars that have been poking us, but just tending to the sapling because it's going to play its part. And the briars that had been cutting us earlier also may have a part to play. So we don't really need to cut down all the briars, but we need to notice that the tree is growing and that we need to prioritize or take seriously the new thing.
Because psyche is going somewhere. And if we focus on the briars and the poison ivy and all that stuff, no, that's the wrong place to place very much attention. Focus on what is trying to grow, which means paying attention to fantasies and happenstances and unwelcome things that seem like distractions or unimportant or a nuisance or uncomfortable or just plain silly, but to pay attention to those, because that is often where the new thing starts to arise.
Yeah, so I think what we're saying again, and Joseph used similar is this so well before, that the new attitude involves the addition to the conscious attitude of what has dropped into the unconscious and can't be accessed.
Yeah.
And it's when that gets lifted up and incorporated somehow. And that is not something that you can do with your ego. You have to sort of just, shake the jar or just kind of surrender and let that happen. And, and I'm thinking about cornstarch pudding and butter. Patience. I mean, the thing about our egos is we want what we want when we want it. And it might not happen in the time frame that you wanted. And like Jung says in that passage, it might be a disappointment when it gets there. It's not what consciousness imagined. And yet it's the right thing.
And the goal of the new attitude is always to free up energy. And then that energy is put in service to actualizing your potential. And that potential is often mysterious to us. The shadow work that happens in the beginning of an analysis is more familiar because it's something that at some point we knew. And then our hand was slapped or something, and we're like, oh, that's going to go in the basket. But when the libido is freed up from the neurotic cramp, I love that idea of the conscious cramp.
Yeah.
From the neurotic cramp, that energy starts feeding seed ideas, seed traits that we didn't even know about ourselves, and they begin to press upon us in ways that cause a fascination. A new fascination is often the outcome of the freed up energy.
I think the conscious cramp could be a good name for like a band or a cafe or a drink. A drink, maybe.
Be great for a process group.
And it's so vivid and can be imagined so literally of like, the first thing that happens when I have a cramp is it's like, oh, okay, how do I make it go away? How do I make it go away? Recently there's one place that tends to cramp, and I've been just sitting down and sort of letting it happen and relaxing into it, of just rather than that activation and the sort of tightening up of, how do I get rid of it, is, oh, okay. And it will relax. So it's, what do we do with our conscious cramps? Once we get past that instant urge to banish it, that there's usefulness there. Something is speaking to us. And there are tremendous parallels between the body and psychology. I wonder if we should talk a little bit about neurosis and what that is, because that's sort of an old-fashioned term that people don't use much anymore, perhaps thanks to the DSM and its multiplicity of symptoms and diagnoses. But that place in all of us that where consciousness and the unconsciousness are in conflict. And, Freud and other people have seen these inner conflicts somewhat differently. But, there's a lot of overlap. That for Freud, it was the conflict between values from our families and culture that become internalized and we adopt them, and our biological urges that were usually associated with aggression and psychic energy and just basic biological drives. An ego psychologist, Hans Kohut, thought about neurosis as our need to be validated and our need to be able to depend on others to meet our needs and have a place to belong that our families may not have provided. In some way, I think we kind of all have to find a way to survive our childhoods. The experiential psychologists like Carl Rogers and Fritz Perls kind of framed it as conflicts between what the social system dictates and our need to self-actualize, to achieve our full potential, to individuate, to do what we want to do with independently and spontaneously, and with some ability to kind of have reality checks with the real world. Erik Erikson was a psychologist who had 8 stages of development, and in each one there's sort of an ambivalence or a conflict to be resolved, like between trust and mistrust in the first year of life, later on between identity and role confusion, or in older years between the forces of integration and despair for elderly people. And so it goes. The existential people talk about the need to find meaning in a universe that's incomprehensible and defies our rational mind, and because of the inevitability of death. So there it goes. We all have these kinds of conflicts. And if the world has not been as welcoming as it might have, then we can get stuck in any of these places. And we often need a new attitude.
So an example that is common enough is that people will come in and they'll talk about a conflict, maybe with a loved one, a parent, and they'll describe the altercation. And then at the end they'll say, and then I became so depressed. I was exhausted. I just could barely get out of bed. So maybe dad visits, and while he's visiting, he's criticizing every repair you made in the house. It's like, oh, you built that shed, but really, it is actually not perfectly square. So, if you need some help, I can do that. Or you painted that room, but there is a spot up there in the top right corner where actually you got some of the wall paint on the ceiling there. I can give you some pointers about that. And so it goes and goes, and the longer it goes, the more exhausted and depressed and de-energized, the fellow becomes. And then, if they have an analyst, perhaps the analyst will say, Freud once said that depression is repressed anger turned against the self. And then if the person actually can connect to that, they're like, oh yeah, actually, I was incredibly angry when he said that my shed wasn't square and said that my painting was sloppy. I was furious. And that's an example of the missing part of the attitude, that the anger needed to join the experience. It was happening, but it took a lot of energy to keep smushing it down because there was some attitude that said you have to respect your parents. You can never disagree with them, particularly if you're from a culture that reinforces that strongly.
And especially when dad is trying to help you.
He's so helpful. And so we actually don't know or can't know the underlying anger. So when that, not just academically, is considered, but actually we suddenly feel it as we're reviewing the memory, often people are angry, but they also feel really energized. They feel a lot of vitality. What they're going to do with that is up to them.
But it does change the way you might relate to that experience.
Absolutely. You don't feel so deadened around it.
And there's often such relief, when the true, authentic feelings can come to light of like, oh, I was angry. Dad was really being critical. And I was so proud of the shed I'd built and the room I painted. There's a huge, huge amount of relief at acknowledging these forbidden feelings, just like, all these people have talked about, of what you're supposed to and what you really
Right. And emotions always have lots of information in them. So when you can feel your feelings, you have a more well-rounded view, perspective, attitude about the situation that you're in, and you can use that to, make various decisions. So, I'm also thinking, Joseph, your example made me think a little bit about what in psychotherapy is often called reframing.
Mhm.
And although I don't think reframing is always the same thing as developing a new attitude, I mean, I think there can be moments when someone says something to you and helps you see your situation in a different way. And sometimes that's your analyst who just drops the right penny at the right time, and suddenly a new vista opens. But a lot of what a lot of therapists do, not just Jungians, but therapists in general, the technique is reframing. It's like, my friend has moved on because she doesn't call anymore. And it's like, well, maybe your friend just got busier. That's not a great example of reframing, actually. I'm having trouble coming up with one on the cuff.
I
but
have one.
Go ahead. Yeah, thanks.
I have a couple of one time I had been in another field, and I was probably earlier mid 40s, somewhere in there. And she got together and we were talking, and she wanted some real sort of consultation and brainstorming about what she should do in the same field and how to solve this problem and how to do this campaign, and all the rest of it. And we were just going along and going along. And all of a sudden I said, geez, you're so into this. And I'm just not anymore. Isn't that funny?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, oh, yeah, that's because you're in the wrong field.
Oh, God.
And I was like, what? And she said, oh, yeah, you should be in counseling. And it hit me like somebody throwing cold water in my face. It was like, whoa. And that was a total reframe. And then reframing is ongoing. I was talking to somebody else because the idea had taken root in me, like, oh my gosh, that's got a lot of energy. Talked to somebody else. I said, I know, but here I am, really in the middle of my 40s, and I'm looking at 50. And this person said, yeah, but you're going to be 50 anyway.
Right.
Right.
Like, that's a great reframe. That's a great reframe.
And then I started looking into it.
Well, it's a reframe, but also your counselor had been listening or intuiting deeply enough that they were able to language something that was emergent. And so in that way, your therapist was able to link your conscious mind to something that actually was brewing, baking in there quietly.
These were, one was a relative and one was a friend. So it can come from anywhere.
Yes. But you're right. I mean, in a way, those two interventions are a little different. The second one is definitely a reframe because it's just like, well, you think about it like that, or you could think about it like this. It's just like a different way of thinking about things. But the first one, it's really remarkable because, and I think it's worth lifting up because I think this does happen a lot of times. There's something we know, but we don't yet know we know it. And then maybe someone puts it into words and that releases the new attitude or plants a seed so the new attitude can begin to grow.
It's a big thing to know that you know what you know.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
I do find this idea of reframing and the value of it interesting. Yes, it of course can help us come in touch with some unconscious potential, but there's something else about it. And I think this is where philosophy comes in, where there's a system of orientation that we can try on for size to see what it does to us. Does it make us calmer, happier, or not? Does it make it seem like we can orient more comfortably or safely to life? Right now, which we had on the podcast, there's a great rise in Stoicism. And Stoicism is offering ways of reframing the experiences of one's life. AA is a reframing process where it comes from the outside in, which was something you were talking about in the quote. If it sticks, then often it's resonating with something that was already there, and the words that come in are close enough that it can take root. And then, as happens in dreams, it spontaneously sometimes just announces itself, often through a dramatized experience in the dream. But either way, the proof in the pudding is whether or not it takes root. And if it does, then we feel different.
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought those two examples up, because I think that that is one of the great benefits of philosophy, especially philosophies that kind of offer sort of ideas about how to live, which also religious systems do as well, and AA does as well. And we could kind of think about these as systems for cultivating a different attitude. So especially, I think, Joseph, your two examples, Stoicism and AA. I mean, you go to AA and they are going to walk you through how to cultivate the new attitude. And the first step is you got to give up the old one. Just like I said with my experience, one of the, after I finished throwing my tantrum internally, it was like, I guess I just got to surrender, which is exactly the first thing you do in AA,
Right.
And Stoicism as well. I mean, Stoicism literally kind of says, instead of thinking about it like this, think about it like this and see how that feels. See if that makes you feel any better,
Which is an experiment.
It is an experiment. And there's a ton of sort of, I want to say, like, psychological technology around thinking about things differently that can be part of developing the new attitude. I mean, I think, Jung is so clear to say you can't force it. And I think your point, Joseph, is really well taken. You could try to force Stoicism, but if it doesn't take root, it's not going to work. It might, like Jung said, come from the outside. Stoicism, that's so interesting. You start reading, studying, listening to podcasts, and then it really takes root and becomes a profound inner experience. And then you are doing the work of cultivating a new attitude.
And that goes, even in Jungian work, it goes to the element of education, which is something that Jung talked about as part of analysis. Another way that I'll phrase that to my clients is they'll talk about certain people in their lives, and maybe they'll say the same 2 or 3 sentences. Oh, that person's such an asshole. And it doesn't go any deeper than that. And often I will say, you need a much more comprehensive theory of personality.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
Because there's so many other additional ways of describing and imagining, why is that person saying that brutal thing? What exactly are they saying? What does it mean? And so another way I'll say it to people is, you need to complexify that. That anything that's that simple is a lot of missing information. And so we can turn to Jung as a philosopher around the human psyche and say, well, what about these principles? Any evidence that any of that's possible? Sometimes they'll get frustrated with me because they really just wanted to, say it and move on because it's gratifying, to just announce this person's a jerk. So they can feel frustrated when I ask them to complexify it, or if I do a functional analysis of the interaction and add a bunch of layers. That's another thing that we do, is we'll model this idea of adding possible layers of meaning through functional analysis of a moment, and then offer that back to the person to see if any of these additional possibilities frees up something in them.
What I'm liking about all of this, what you've just added, but I think it's a thread running through our discussion today, is it is doable. This is not the magical mystery tour. There are steps you can take, ways you can think, things you can read, people you can listen to, conversations you can pay attention to, dream images you can have reveries about and journal about. It's actually very doable.
with the caveat that it's an insoluble problem. And what you have to do is do nothing and let things happen. So there's a paradox.
I agree. Let me rephrase what I just said.
Well, it's sort of both and, I think, right?
It's a both and, but ego can do the going toward. Ego can approach, ego can listen, ego can do certain things, the willingness, and take some initiative. We can't command the unconscious, but it often starts, as does dream recall, with, I really would like to move toward you. I'm paying attention. I'm facing this direction from which I hope something will come. And when it does, I am ready to receive it. I'm open.
Coming back to what you had read earlier, Lisa, just the last 2 sentences or so, and this goes to what we're intimating, that the ego can make this easier on itself, and although it's not going to know everything. So you had said that in this way, a new attitude is created, an attitude that accepts the irrational and the incomprehensible, simply because it is happening. This attitude would be poison for a person who's already overwhelmed by the things that happen to him. But it is of the greatest value for one who selects from among the many things that happen only those that are acceptable to his conscious judgment, and is gradually drawn out of the stream of life and into a stagnant backwater. So even just that little bit, am I the kind of person that notices a bunch of things in my fantasies or even in my dreams, and I only pay attention to the things that are acceptable to my day-to-day attitude and judgment? Or do I, as a discipline of the ego, pay attention to the things that I don't like, which is basically just shadow stuff? If I ask most people, what do you not like to think about? Most people will they have a list. I don't like to think about death, or I don't like to think about whatever it is. It's like, well, there's the gold, or the beginning of a piece of it. And that can happen at the level of the ego making a decision to at least turn in the direction of the thing we're avoiding. What the actual missing information is, just as you were saying, Lisa, has to reveal itself. But we can have enough muscle to at least face towards the stench and start walking towards it, which is why I think Jung said analysis is for the second half of life, because we've got to have enough muscle, so to speak, on our ego to do something like that.
Today's dreamer is a 72-year-old woman who works as an artist, and she actually gives us 2 dreams, and one is headless man, and the other is bodiless man. So she says, I had 2 dreams that seem related. In the first one, I'm in the entrance to my mother's apartment building in Florence. It is made of vast gray stones, high ceilings, cold and bleak. A stairway curves away and upwards on the left side, and on the right is the lift. I'm standing in front of the lift when a man comes in. He has no head. His neck is rounded off and smooth at the top. He is swarthy and strong, bare-chested, wearing trousers. I'm afraid of him, though he makes no move towards me, and in fact, he makes a cheery gesture with his hands, sort of a thumbs up. I press the lift button, wanting to get away. Then he comes back down the stairs. The lift won't respond. He passes near me, and I am frightened. He makes the thumbs up sign again, as if to reassure me, and heads, no pun intended, for the front door. His presence terrifies me, and the lift won't come. I shout at the lift, just let me in! A few weeks later, I dream I am coming out of a big, rather grand hotel with a man friend. Just behind, a man with a head and no body is coming out of the hotel. He seems to take offense at something I have said or done. My friend says he will speak to him on my behalf. I say no, I will. He says, she will speak to me. I kneel down to speak to him. He is handsome with curly dark hair. I say to him in Italian, I'm sorry, I did not mean to be discourteous. He is pleased and repeats what I have said. So she says, I can't think of any particular life transitions. I've been very focused on learning to lucid dream for several months with a little success. And what were the main feelings in the dream? In the first one, panic and fear. In the second one, a wish to assure the bodiless man that I respect him and wouldn't wish to offend him. I couldn't see what I had done to make him take offense. Maybe I stared at him for a moment. And her associations, she said, the headless man, blind brute, nature, instinct, lack of intelligence and reason, but also pure instinct, intuition, and simplicity. The bodiless man, intellect, mind, fragile pride, helplessness.
And such opposites, right?
Well, and very complementary.
Yes, exactly. A body without a head without a body, really can be such an image of the split that we all have between sort of cognition and rationality and get your head on straight, use your head, versus where our bodies and physiology, instinct, and the seat and site where emotions arise. And it seems in the dream that the headless man, that inspires panic and fear and she says it. She's got a lot of insight already of the headless man, lack of intelligence and reason, but also pure instinct, intuition, and simplicity.
So my thought about this dream initially is, first of all, I think it's important that she's at her mother's apartment. And I would be, of course, curious about what that relationship was like. So we're something about the mother complex here. And it's interesting that there's a stairs and a lift, and she's going to take the lift. She could take the stairs potentially, but she's going to try to take the lift. And of course, it struck me in particular that the man was not wearing a shirt, and he's got a very well-developed physique. And it struck me that the dream is a very poignant. I mean, I felt some sadness as I read this dream, because I was imagining that it's a little bit of an invitation from her embodied self, from her body, to sort of make friends. There's the thumbs up sign, but she recoils in fear and panic. So I do think there's something here about the body and the body being discounted, and somehow that there's some relationship there with the mother complex.
The thing that I would be curious about if she was here is, what was her mother's relationship to men and to the masculine? That when we're being raised, whatever our parents respond to negatively or with fear, as a child, we simply take that in because it's the way we know what's dangerous in the environment. This is very obvious when you see a mama cat with kittens. Mama cat looks at something, she hisses and bristles. All the kittens will hiss and bristle, although they're not even looking in the same direction, because they're learning from her responses. So if the physicality of men, for instance, or their relative size, or perhaps even being shirtless, whatever that kind of raw sexuality, if that's disturbing to mom, if mama cat hisses and backs up, kitten's going to think, "Ooh, stay away from that." So I'm wondering about a kind of inherited anxiety around men or the masculine that in the dream is wonderfully being depicted as harmless. Like the objective view of the dream is nothing bad is really happening. I mean, it's uncanny to see someone without a head, but there really is nothing dangerous. So it forces the dreamer to go, it must be my attitude towards this because the dream maker's not showing me anything I should be flipping out about.
Yeah, and the headless man keeps giving her the thumbs up. He's friendly.
Yeah. Just as one little bit is that the word Florence originates from the Latin name Florentia, which means flourishing or prosperous. I know she's associated with her mom, and that's factual. But she's in this place where flourishing is possible, and this kind of robust, instinctive masculine is just kind of ambling about, being friendly to her. So that, I don't know, gives me a little sense that if she were to somehow figure out how to befriend the headless guy with the great body, that, some flourishing potential might happen.
We could think about it in sort of a classical Jungian sense, right? That these are two different images of a kind of split animus. Mm-hmm. And that one is very instinctual and rooted in the body, and that one she rejects. But the one that's very heady,
literally,
see what I did there? And intellectual is one that she goes to great lengths to say, I respect you. I mean, she's not freaked out to see a bodiless head. She's freaked out to see a headless body. So somehow it's the body that trips her up. And so in terms of the kind of creative force within her, maybe she's too taken with the intellectual aspect of it. And it's really the rooted, embodied, instinctual aspect that is asking to be admitted.
Just as an association, there's a movie from 1988 called The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. And one of the scenes is played by Robin Williams, plays the King of the Moon. And the King of the Moon's head actually can detach itself, and it flies around and has its own opinions. And then the body is kind of ambling about doing other things. And so over the course of this interaction in the movie, getting, kind of capturing the head and sticking it on the body changes the personality of the King of the Moon. So there is something archetypal about her image from the dream. And of course, in the Splendor Solis, there's this image of decapitation. There's again, that's separation of mind and body, sometimes which might be necessary in an alchemical transformation, because in that particular depiction, the head is gold and the body is kind of chopped up and not useful. But here it certainly seems that by comparison that the two, like the King of the Moon, need to find each other, and then what interesting thing might happen then.
Mm-hmm. That's nice. Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.